At its absolute peak, the Roman Empire governed 70 million subjects. Its borders spanned 3 continents, encompassing roughly a third of the global population. Looking at a map of that scale today, we often assume it was the result of a deliberate, centuries-long plan for world conquest. Emperors like Trajan, who presided over this territorial maximum, certainly projected an image of supreme confidence and destiny. But the early history of the Republic tells a different story. In the beginning, Rome was nothing more than a small, highly vulnerable settlement on the banks of the Tiber. Rome expanded as a series of desperate responses to immediate survival threats. The empire was an accidental accumulation of territory, rather than the result of a calculated vision for global power. The early Mediterranean was a highly militarized, anarchic war zone. It was a landscape of competing city-states and tribes, where power was constantly shifting. In this environment, every state faced a zero-sum security dilemma. Any move you made to protect your own walls was seen by your neighbors as an inherent threat, forcing them to arm themselves in response. This produced a state of continuous dread that the Romans called terrores multi. Surviving required a society that was permanently mobilized and ready for battle at a moment's notice. Defeating a neighboring rival in a single campaign was relatively simple. The much larger challenge was the logistical burden of holding that new ground, stationing troops, and paying for their supplies. So how did a paranoid defensive city-state manage to solve those logistics and stabilize itself into a permanent superpower? The answer lies in 3 structural pillars. The first was a revolutionary approach to generating military manpower that focused on political integration over weaponry. Using a strategy of divide and rule, the Romans broke the ancient mold by offering their defeated neighbors a deal instead of total destruction. This was the socii system. Rome granted conquered peoples legal protection and citizenship, but demanded a strict quota of troops. This created a limitless well of manpower. When Rome faced disasters, the socii network simply produced a fresh army to replace the lost one. By the time the dust settled, Rome had successfully turned its defeated enemies into the fuel for its own military engine. Once the borders moved beyond Italy, direct military occupation of every square mile became a logistical impossibility for an ancient state. To maintain control, Rome utilized client states. They outsourced their border security to wealthy local kings, providing them with Roman backing in exchange for maintaining local order. Simultaneously, the Romans shifted the enormous financial cost of the army outward. While citizens back in Italy were largely exempt from direct taxes, the provincial subjects were forced to carry the burden. They used the publicani, private tax collectors who won contracts to extract provincial wealth. These syndicates ensured the Roman army remained funded without needing to tax the voters back in the capital. By outsourcing governance and taxing the provinces, Rome created a self-sustaining loop where conquest provided the funding for the next campaign. But paper treaties and tax contracts are fragile. Without a physical way to connect distant lands, any empire of this scale will eventually fracture. The third pillar was massive civil engineering. Rome built a standardized network of roads and aqueducts designed to project power and support massive urban populations. Using self-healing puzzle-lanic concrete, they paved a permanent network of military roads. These routes acted as the empire's physical arteries, allowing the fast movement of legions from Britain to the edges of Persia. On the water, the navy aggressively cleared out pirates to secure Mare Nostrum, our sea. This turned the Mediterranean into a safe, massive-scale maritime highway for the movement of goods and grain. This hard infrastructure catalyzed the Pax Romana. It transformed a sprawling military occupation into a highly integrated economic powerhouse. Eventually, the Roman engine reached the absolute limits of ancient logistics. The empire had grown as far as animal transport and sailing ships could reasonably sustain. Under Emperor Augustus, the state underwent a massive strategic shift. He abandoned the policy of limitless expansion in favor of a professionalized, deliberate policy of defense for the established borders. The system's underlying machinery was now so robust it could function even when the political center collapsed. Local tax syndicates continued funding the legions, and the road network kept soldiers moving, even when the Praetorian Guard was busy assassinating sitting emperors or auctioning off the throne. The system proved its flexibility, even during the crisis of the 3rd century. When the administrative burden became too great for one man, the empire simply split into eastern and western halves to survive. The structural logic of the Roman state was vastly stronger than any single ruler or political crisis. The map of Rome is a record of centuries of trial and error. It represents the accumulated responses of generations of commanders and bureaucrats who had to solve local problems that eventually scaled into a global system. The empire's creation was an emergent property, a masterpiece of evolutionary adaptation to a deeply hostile and competitive world. While the Western Empire eventually fell, the physical ruins of its structural pillars are still visible across the landscape today. Success was built on 3 mechanisms: the military pragmatism of the Soci manpower system, the diplomatic flexibility of indirect rule, and the revolutionary reach of Roman infrastructure. The lasting achievement of Rome was the definition of the structural blueprint for imperial governance, a model of military mobilization and political integration that modern states continue to replicate.